Careful of it.
As you can tell, we're experts at this.
It's under control.
Thank you, John. Okay, well, good afternoon and welcome to the Politics Department's panel discussion, Thoughts on the State of Our Union. I want to thank my colleagues for agreeing to participate in the panel, and to Kane, Turner, and Morian, an obstacle for organizing and advertising the event, and for recording it. It is being recorded, so watch what you say. I say that especially to my colleagues. And to the Culp Foundation for providing funding for such events. To that end, I would appreciate it if you could fill out the evaluation forms, which have been distributed already, so we can provide some feedback to the Culp Foundation concerning the programs that we're sponsoring. They would particularly like it if you provided them an email address so that they can send you additional information about the activities that they sponsor. I will note that a number of our students have actually been awarded free books for providing their email. To our topic then. I understand that many on campus, and roughly half of America, indeed almost exactly half of America, is disappointed by the outcome of this week's presidential election. Well, those of us who think that Western civilization has been in decline since roughly 1320 are not so chagrined by the news. The American people have spoken in the way that they do every 4 years, and now we have to play the field the way it has been striped. And I would suggest at the outset that one should be of good cheer, because things could be worse. Indeed, I think they will be worse. So enjoy the present. Let us turn, though, to today's panelists. I'll introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. First, Dr. Tiffany Miller will be speaking on our fiscal situation. Dr. Miller, for those of you who don't know, is the director of our graduate program. So if you're interested in the graduate program, talk to Dr. Miller. Then Dr. Upham, Dr. David Upham will speak on the election itself and the question of whether the election reflects any fundamental change in the electorate. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Upham is our pre-law director, so if you're interested in law school, talk to Dr. Upham. Then Dr. Jonathan Culp, at the end, will speak about the international situation that we are in and we will be facing. For those of you who don't know it, Dr. Culp is the head of our International Studies concentration. If you're interested in international studies, talk to Dr. Culp. And then Dr. Daniel Burns will speak on the election and the Catholic Church. For those of you who don't know Dr. Burns, he is our new hire. I welcome him to be baptized by fire this afternoon. And then finally, I will be speaking on the Obama presidency itself, the last 4 years, and something about prospects for the next 4 years. So first,
you don't know, he's the chair. So if you want to get hired, talk to him.
okay, so please welcome Dr. Miller.
There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 empty chairs for people who don't have chairs. So if everybody could either just move in a little, or if you really like sitting there or standing, I'm not going to stop you.
So if you want a place to sit, talk to him.
I think there would be a general degree of agreement on both sides that the election that we had this week marked an important referendum on what the role of government in the United States is. And certainly if you were reading commentary on the left, there was great concern that should Mitt Romney win, he would repeal 100 years of progressive reform, beginning with the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. And certainly on the right, many commentators kind of looked at this as perhaps the last hurrah of limited government in the United States, of individual freedom in the founder's sense, before kind of gaining the critical mass in the electorate that consolidated progressive control in America. And this struggle that's been going on for the soul of America for the last 100 years has arguably reached a critical turning point. The focus of my remarks this evening, short as they will be, is to pick up one of the implications of that struggle and where it leaves us today. And that is our fiscal situation, which has grown, if you haven't noticed, increasingly bad in recent years. And this is something that, if you're following the news commentary just in the last day or so, you'll see that quickly attention is turning back to the fiscal problem. Right? This is a long-brewing problem. We've aggravated the severity of the problem over the last 4 years, and there are some very important policy decisions awaiting decision either at the end of this year or in January. And so all of a sudden, in fact, Obama has been on the phone with Harry Reid and John Boehner already talking about what can we do about this. Just to give you a little sense, you're going to hear a lot of discussion in the news about the fiscal cliff, kind of as our most immediate challenge. Okay, what is the fiscal cliff? The fiscal cliff does not refer to the longer-term challenge we're facing. The longer-term challenges that aren't very long-term, actually, anymore. The fiscal cliff is a reference to the fact that there are a variety of policies that are expiring at the end of this year. So, for example, the Bush tax cuts, the income tax cuts, most recently extended in 2010. There are a variety of other tax increases that will take effect unless Congress acts. One of which was, you might recall, that President Obama and the Congress supported reducing the payroll tax contribution to Social Security by a couple of percentage. And that's about to expire as well. The end of the alternative minimum tax patch, which was initially, the alternative minimum tax was a tax that was geared towards the super wealthy. And what Congress has been doing basically from year to year is adjusting who it affects to inflation, thereby kind of reserving its effect to a fairly small portion of income earners. And if they fail to do that, that'll hit about 30-some-odd more million Americans, reaching pretty deeply into the middle class. There are a variety of other policy changes that are due to take effect. Probably the most significant one, two. One, the sequestration cuts. So this was the consequence of a year ago, August. We had the debt ceiling deal. Congress and the President signed the Budget and Control Act to agreeing to raise the debt limit in exchange for creating a mechanism to find some significant cuts. So the idea was, let's raise our immediate borrowing authority by about $2.1 trillion, and then let's create a mechanism to find $2.1 trillion worth of cuts over the next 10 years. And that created the Congressional Super Committee, which of course failed, and in the legislation, if they failed, there was a kind of a built-in mechanism that was designed to ensure that they wouldn't, the sequestration cuts that will have cuts government spending about $1.2 trillion worth beginning next year. And so those cuts should begin to take effect in January. And also, the sequestration cuts were the effect of the debt ceiling deal. And looks like it's just about time to raise that debt ceiling again. The experts seem to disagree as to when exactly the Treasury will exhaust the additional authority that the debt ceiling deal provided them, whether that's December, whether that's January. Certainly the Treasury Department has some flexibility in terms of they can kind of stave it off for a short while. But we will have squarely back before us in very short order the need to address the debt ceiling. And what's the debt ceiling? That's the legislative authorization that authorizes the Treasury Department to continue borrowing money in a sum past the baseline of the last piece of legislation. So we've just about blown through what they got as a result of the deal in August a year ago. And we're on the cusp of needing a new infusion. Okay, that's the fiscal cliff. And there's Congress, both sides in Congress, frankly, would like to deal with the fiscal cliff. The concern is if we don't deal with the fiscal cliff, we're going to, if you have a kind of this combination of large tax increases, and by the way, the tax increases with the expiration of the Bush tax cuts and the extension of who the alternative minimum tax cut, alternative minimum tax affects, the expiration of these FICA contributions, the measurements or the economists who are trying to measure what would be the effect on average for American households, you're talking about a $3,500 tax increase next year. So it's not insignificant. And then on the spending side, like I've already mentioned, that you've got the sequestration cuts that sound very significant, and certainly in the short term would be, although as we'll see, they're not anywhere near as significant as they need to be. And so the concern is, with this combination of tax increases and spending cuts, it will take our very fragile recovery and throw us back into a recession, thus creating a double-dip recession. All right, so that's the fiscal cliff. Now, the fiscal cliff, as I say, is an important part, an important component of it. The sequestration cuts is a direct outgrowth of a larger kind of fiscal situation that we have in our most recent attempt to deal with it. And I just wanted to kind of lay out what that situation is. When we talk about, and if you start paying attention to the press, okay, you'll hear a variety of measures of how indebted the government is, okay? You'll hear discussion of the deficit. You'll hear discussion of the debt. And what you won't hear, but is the one you should pay attention to, is something called the fiscal gap. Okay, what are these? The deficit. Okay, the deficit is a measure of how much spending in a given year exceeds revenues. Okay, so what you have here on this first chart, it's not the best chart, I was looking for a better one but couldn't find one. But in effect, what it shows you is over the last 4 years we have had $1 trillion plus deficits. Okay, we've accelerated spending in a lot of ways over the last 4 years in response to the recession. And so what you see here, beginning in 2009, we have the actual deficit of 1.41 trillion. In 2010, 1.29 trillion. In 2011, 1.3 trillion. And this year, it went way down because it's 1.1 trillion. Okay? And that's the way it was reported, actually. But in any case, what you can see then, and these are the projections, the CBO projections about where we're going in the future. Notice the pattern. Okay? Deficits, we not only have permanent deficits, they're getting bigger. All right? That's the deficit. And so the deficit, when we talk about the most recent deficit, the 1.1 trillion, we're just talking about the amount of money the federal government spent in excess of revenues last year. Okay? Just last year. Now, federal debt. Okay? The federal debt. There are 3 different ways of measuring the federal debt. And let me see if I can find this is the Treasury Department, actually. This is called the debt to the penny and who holds it. And basically what this tells you are the 3 different measures of the federal debt and where they stand up to the day. Okay, so it shows you the 3 different measures. The first is debt held by the public. And that's over nearly 11.4 trillion. The second is intergovernmental holdings, or sometimes debt held by the government. Okay, this is basically the first represents the amount of money the federal government is borrowing by selling securities. Okay, so borrowing by selling securities, bonds to investors. The second represents basically the amount of money that the government borrowed from itself, from some things like the Social Security Trust Fund, and any other trust fund it creates. And the last is the total. It's called the gross debt. Total public debt or the gross debt. That's the $16 trillion number. Okay? That is the federal debt. And you're starting to hear a lot about that $16 trillion number. That's the total amount of money that the federal government has already borrowed from one source or another to cover spending in excess of its revenues. Now, the problem is that that debt is going to is set to skyrocket. Okay, so we have deficits. Here you see federal budget deficits will reach levels never before seen in the United States. So basically our deficits, like I said, permanent and growing larger. And look at that, okay? But as a percentage of GDP is skyrocketing. And then let's see. Where's the other one? Yes, this is the other one I want. Publicly held debt set to skyrocket. Once again, this is the first measure. This isn't even the widest measure of the debt. This is debt held by the public, okay? So here we are, and this is the upward track that we are on, all right? And perhaps even more chilling is the fact that this puts us in the company of governments you'd rather not be in the company of. Let's see, I wonder if I can find the, sorry about that, let's see. There it is. Okay, It's kind of situating our publicly held debt, and as a percent of, one of the common measures of that is debt to GDP. Okay, so what percentage is our debt, the publicly held portion, in relation to gross domestic product? And what you see is a sharp increase, and our sharp increase, and that's ultimately puts us, if you follow the trajectory, right? 2011, that's the U.S. debt at 67% of GDP. That's only the debt held by the public. If you use the broader measure, it's over 100% of GDP right now. The IMF, for example, uses the broader measure. So there's a dispute among economists what it should be. But as you see, right, that puts us beneath the UK, Italy, Japan, but we're going to steadily surpass them because of the permanent and growing size of the deficits. Okay? So if you really want to understand how much money, how badly the government has overspent its revenues, look into this. This is an economic measure. This is a statistic that economists use called fiscal gap. And what it does basically is it compares all future scheduled spending. So every program and makes all kinds of estimates, and you're looking at, they use different timelines. There's a lot of different kind of educated guesses that go into this. Because you're looking at a timeline, are you looking at a 75-year timeline? Are you looking at the infinite time horizon? How long out should we be measuring, okay? And then they have to make all kinds of projections about what the cost of programs will be, like Social Security, and it has to do with the number of senior citizens who are surviving and drawing benefits and so forth. It has to do with Medicare, not just the number, but also healthcare inflation, a whole host of things. But if you look at the fiscal gap, okay, the fiscal gap, measures of it vary, okay? But this is from the GAO, Government Accountability Office, all right? CBO uses this, the IMF uses this. It's not something you hear much about, but it's a statistic you need to pay attention to. And basically what they're doing, as I say, they're measuring, they're trying to assess how much has all the scheduled spending in the future outstripped the scheduled revenues. And you're talking, the GAO is basically saying present value dollars, $99.4 trillion. And you're going to see estimates ranging from basically 100 trillion upwards of 200 trillion. Okay? So in other words, what that means is the federal government has promised benefits in $100 trillion in excess of the revenues it has scheduled to collect. All right? That is our long-term fiscal challenge. Okay? I notice I'm already out of time here, so what we can do in the question and answer period, if you like, I brought in some other links to address some of the common proposals, the bold initiatives that the politicians are currently suggesting in terms of dealing with this, and just want to show you that we're not anywhere near serious about this at the moment, because the American people have no idea how bad the situation is, and don't realize that the period of time that we've been enjoyed for a number of decades in which you could have very generous government benefits with very low, relatively low taxes is gone. Demographically, it's gone, and so we face some very painful choices, even if involving ultimately probably a combination of serious tax increases and some benefits cut. In any case, thank you.
Dr. Upham. Yeah, we're gonna do question and answers after everyone's done with their presentation.
I'm going to make an effort to be temperate here with my use of time. In part, because I think I can be, because in large measure, my presentation can be summed up in one word: stunned. I'm stunned. I'm perplexed, and I don't have any guide for Maimonides or anything like that. Not stunned by the eventual result, okay, because it was within the realm of what polls suggested, but by the following facts. President Obama received about 10 million fewer votes than he did in 2008. Okay. The Republican candidate, Mitt Romney, won independent votes by 5 points. The first time the Republican presidential candidate has done that since 1988. And third, evangelicals formed the largest portion of the electorate they've ever had, 24%. And they voted 79% for Romney, much as they did for Bush, a record in 2004. If you told me that's how it's going to play out, I'd say this is going to be an early 90s. Mitt Romney's going to win, easily. It's going to look like 1988. And still he lost.
And if you look at the Electoral College map, only 2 states flipped, North Carolina and Indiana, both of which were predicted to flip. Some facts about the electorate were less stunning. Predictable, but interesting. The Republican Party at the presidential level continues its collapse among non-white voters, groups that are becoming an increasing share of the electorate. Hispanics reach 10% of the electorate, Asian Americans reach 3%, and Mitt Romney received about 25% of those votes. Bush in 2004 received 40, some people even say over 40% of those constituencies. And with reference to Asian American voters, it's quite striking because Asian American voters on average used to vote Republican. As late as 1996, a pretty bad year for Republicans, Asian Americans voted primarily for Bob Dole. If, by my calculations, I was doing a little bit of math, I'm not a political scientist, okay? Numbers are a little scary to me, but I did a little arithmetic. By my calculations, if Romney had won the same percentage of the Hispanic and Asian vote that George Bush did in 2004, he would have narrowly won. Another thing that was less stunning, but somewhat predictable, is the degree to which Barack Obama's campaign had a very effective strategy in targeting certain states, because their performance in those states was significantly better than the performance on average across the other states, particularly in Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, etc. There was a 5-point swing nationally, but in those states it was far, about a 2-point swing toward the Republican candidate. So what happened? I don't know. I have a rough idea. I've been reading some things about what they call the vanishing. It wasn't so much that, certainly again, Romney did what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to be the moderate candidate, appeal to the suburbs, win the independent vote. But apparently there is significant sort of white vote that did not turn out in raw numbers, okay? Not just in terms of percentages. That was to be expected because the whites are a small percentage of the population, but even in terms of raw numbers. And some of the preliminary data strongly suggests that you have an increasingly polarized electorate along the lines of economic status. Some of that was moving in the opposite direction after the 1960s. After the New Deal, the parties were fairly easily correlated with economic status. But some of that, with social conservatism issues, other issues, was somewhat moderated during the 60s, 70s, 80s. It seems that Romney won pretty nicely above with those making over $50,000 a year, but lost heavily with those making less than $50,000 a year. And I think, the impression I'm getting, is a significant portion of the electorate that is making less than $50,000 a year are either uninclined to vote at all, and certainly not, or are voting for the party that promises them security. And that seems to me reasonable and understandable. When the economy stagnates, when a critical mass of people is more worried about becoming desperately poor than is hoping to enjoy upward mobility, it's understandable they're not going to place their faith in a free market that is unlikely to deliver. And they're more likely to place their faith in a government that at least the government is dependent upon them for votes. Their employer is not dependent upon them for votes. Their employer has a constituency of shareholders, not the employers, not the employees. And so there seem to be long-term trends within the short term favoring a political philosophy that says more government security, less self-reliance, which seems increasingly illusory to lots of Americans. But as Dr. Miller pointed out, a lot of these long-term trends spell a certain doom. And because it's just simply not sustainable. I'm going to engage in some amateur demographics here, but with an effort to talk about just a little bit of the political effects of certain demographic things. I apologize for how crude this is going to appear on the board. Do we have a marker? Yes, right there. Way back in olden times, population structures look like this. Roughly equivalent number of older people and children. Because there's lots of babies born, but they're getting knocked off pretty quickly. high infant mortality rates, and lots of early death. Sometime in the early modern era, earlier in some parts of the world than others, especially Europe and especially the United States, that started to change. Better diet, better some hygiene, especially with, better sense of sanitation, everything. You start getting populations that look like this, the so-called population time bomb. Right? So lots of young people and fewer older. And this was because children survived. And these folks at the top, at least for a couple generations, had both the incentive and the cultural habits to say it's good to have big families. Because in the olden days, if you didn't have a big family, you were in tough shape when you were old, because nobody was there to take care of you. So you had children. That's your social security. Now, two things happen. This is all roughly true. You get a cultural shift that says, why are we having kids for so much? Because we have more wealth in our society. Being poor today is nothing like being poor in most times and places in the world. I often tell people, most people in the history of the world pray for obesity, which we consider to be the #1 nutritional problem of the world. Okay? So you're not as concerned about having lots of kids. And plus, the expense of having kids seems to, therefore doesn't make any sense, because children are enormously costly in terms of time and energy and all that. So you start getting populations that look, more like this. And with the availability of contraception, it becomes, and another reason why you get this is because Social Security gets instituted. You get systems that say, we don't want people to be old and to be poor when they're old. So they shouldn't be dependent upon their children. And this system works out, while the population looks like this, works out just fine. There are tons of people working, and they can support all those folks. But, particularly after the baby bust, when you start having massive drop in the number of children, and that drop has been going on for a long time. I mean, the idea of a lot of big families in the 50s was nothing like the 1850s. The American women said like 6, 7 per, on average. That means the women that were spinsters had to be balanced off with UD-sized families. Paul Revere, for instance, had 16 kids. So, now you have this situation, it gets worse. Then you're having other cultural phenomena that produces a different type of problem. You start having not just 2 kids, but you start having 1.3, 1.5, or 1. You get this structure, okay? Mother, father, mother, father, father. Okay. Each one has 1 child. Now, if this child is going to support those 4 kids, it's very impossible. It's very difficult. So, these folks are going to be vulnerable. But it gets worse than that. When you dissolve marriage as an institution, notice what happens in terms of relationships. Again, this is a crude example. This is not exactly America, but it's trending in this direction. Been doing so for several decades now. Well, this child doesn't have really a father. Okay? And these folks are not their grandparents. This guy is a sperm donor, and she's the mother of a sperm donor. And he's a sperm donor. So too over here with the father here. He's a sperm donor. So what does this do politically? First, when these 3 people go into the voting booth, and someone says, "But what about the children and the grandchildren?" Like, I don't have any. That's stupid. I don't have one. So too with this fellow. As a result, this little unit here knows it's vulnerable. Okay? These votes, single moms, single women, that's continuing to drive to the Democratic Party, and it's a growing demographic, and they've got good reason to go to the government. Can't count on this guy. Obviously can't count on these 3. At the same time, this child is almost vulnerable because there's lots of votes out there that are going to say, "Where's my check?" Well, what about the children tomorrow? I'm not going to be here, and I don't have children to worry about. So it produces lots of vulnerabilities and lots of a lack of cultural solidarity. And you can talk about the generation war gap in the 60s, based on values. Well, as James Madison said at Federalist 10, The more enduring and sustainable and exacerbated source of faction is when people have different economic interests. Now, when you have integrated families, these folks don't think, well, if grandma dies, I don't care. If the kid doesn't get a good education, I don't care. But if you don't have those passions, those familial passions, then you have adverse economic interests that are going to produce just a lot of political conflict and potential social disintegration, increasing disintegration. Sorry to be so cheerless there, but that's just...
Thank you, Dave. Dr. Culp.
So we're all doomed to erasure. Okay. Was the joke that bad, Mike, or you just... See you later. All right. So I'm going to shift topic a little bit here, I will get around to talking about America. I'm going to be talking about the international scene that the president will be facing, and obviously, as with a lot of other important political phenomena, you have to be thinking in part about time frames, and so I'm going to be thinking about the next couple of decades. Maybe I'm not going to project too far into the future, but let me kind of circle into my topic here. So, conventionally speaking, since 1648, we have the world has been divided up into territorially distinct, at least nominally sovereign states, existing in an international order characterized by anarchy. Right? There's no world government. There are a lot of states. Each state is responsible for its own survival, and there's nobody that gets to make all the rules and enforce them for the entire world. And that's the kind of order that we live in. And although it is anarchical in that sense, it is not necessarily disorderly, right? 1648 was a long time ago, and we're not all dead yet, so somehow people manage to survive even when there's not a world government. And in fact, for a lot of history, including quite a bit of the later 20th century, there's been quite a lot of peace in the world, despite its anarchical character. Now, unfortunately, the way the world works is you tend to have periods of relative order and peace, sort of periodically marked by catastrophic war, right? So you'll have peace for a while, and then along comes when baby Napoleon grows up. Europe gets into some trouble for a little while, and eventually everybody comes back to their senses, and you get peace again for a little while, and then baby Kaiser Wilhelm grows up, and you get some problems again, and it's okay. But then baby Hitler grows up. It just gets really bad, and I won't even talk about baby Stalin. So it gets really bad, but then things kind of put themselves back together. Well, but throughout all of that history, at least leading up to, let's say, the last 20 years, the international order has been marked by some kind of great power rivalry. There have always been a few centers of power in the world, a few kind of big geopolitical powers that carry disproportionate weight in the international order. And usually how they relate to one another is determinant of how much of the rest of the world goes. Then a funny thing happened, right? You had World War II, and when World War II ended, fairly quickly the Cold War started. I'm assuming you've all heard of the Cold War. That was back when we still looked like squares. Maybe we're getting triangular at that point. I don't know. But the Cold War never turned hot, right? It lasted for quite a while. It was very tense. We just recently passed the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I have been assured was terrifying, but it's passed. And unlike a lot of other transitions in the international order, such as in 1815 or 1939 or something like that, the Cold War came to an end without any kind of catastrophic violence whatsoever. Right? Beginning in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, you had basically, on the whole, and people still died. 1989 was also the year of Tiananmen Square. But you had an end to a major geopolitical rivalry without a shot fired. And this led to a lot of speculation about what kind of world we were entering into. And the US, of course, was especially interested in this because, of course, the United States all of a sudden found itself the single most powerful country in the world, right? With no major geopolitical rival. This is what has sometimes been referred to as the unipolar moment, right? We didn't have to expend hardly any resources at all in the end. So the Cold War ended, we still had our arsenals, we still had our military. And meanwhile, the former Soviet Union began to collapse and to weaken. And this led to some speculation about what's going to happen next. What's going to happen next now? How do you explain this, right? And so you had the very famous thesis associated with Francis Fukuyama, perhaps you've heard of this, the thesis of the end of history. That what the end of the Cold War represented, and what the US was kind of the spearhead of, was that we were entering into a fundamentally new period of history, when those kind of old geopolitical great power rivalries with periodic recurrence to warfare and the like had become outdated, outmoded. That really liberal capitalism in a general sense and democracy in a general sense contained a kind of universal appeal. And as more and more people were given the opportunity to live in such orders, they were going to choose to live in those orders. And the more people that lived in those kind of orders, the less violent conflict you're going to have around the world. So the end of history, the end of ideology, the end of ideological struggle, the triumph of freedom and prosperity. That was one of the theses. And of course, that a lot of people found this very appealing because, of course, we were at the forefront of it in helping to spread democracy, in helping to spread capitalism, in anchoring the global economic order, which we do. And so you had a lot of people that thought, yeah, that's what we're entering into. And so you had the go-go 90s, right? Which had some very horrible events that happened in some areas of the world, but they were treated as almost sort of atavistic or so. They're relics of an earlier order, and eventually that stuff would get worked out, and Rwanda would become liberal and capitalist too, and Bosnia would become liberal and capitalist too, and eventually all those old ancient hatreds and all that, it's going to go away, and we're all going to end up being sort of good liberal Democrats that go to work in the morning and come home at night. But you did have people that dissented from this. Sometimes they call themselves realists, sometimes they call themselves something else. And there was a very famous thesis associated with a man named Samuel Huntington, perhaps you've heard of, who, in response to Fukuyama's end of history, said, no, what we're going to be entering into now is a stage that he characterized as a clash of civilizations. That ideological struggle is gone, yes. Cultural struggle is not. The world will begin to divide along cultural lines. And so you have kind of conflict between a sort of Asian sphere of influence and a Orthodox sphere of influence. And especially for him, one of his concerns was the Islamic sphere of influence. And he argued that cultural differences are so deep and so long-lasting and so hard to change that you can't just eradicate them by throwing money and votes at people. And at the time when that article was written, about 1993, everybody said, that old guy is crazy. And then came Bosnia, and then came Rwanda, and especially, fast forward a little bit, then came 9/11, right? And the rise of the real international profile of Islamic terrorism, which had been in existence for a long time, right? But it really hit the front page with 9/11. And so this led to some more hand-wringing about, well, what actually is the character of the world we live in, and what is America's role? Because after all, America was the primary target of many of these terrorist groups, although not their ultimate target, right? Most of these Islamic organizations, they don't like the United States, they hate the United States, they hate even more the Saudis, and a lot of the corrupt rulers of the regimes in North Africa and the Middle East, hence the Arab Spring, which we've been seeing, where a lot of those people are being overthrown. These are people who are attempting to overthrow. But, so the question was, have we returned to history? Where are we now? And what was interesting is that in the wake of 9/11, with the foreign policy of George W. Bush, we actually found ourselves in kind of an idealistic moment, where the idea was the fundamental premises of the end of history argument, the sort of Bush and his advisors, sometimes they're now called neoconservatives, thought, no, that's really right. It's just that you need some transformational leadership on the part of the United States to help bring around the parts of the world that haven't yet entered into the end of history, right? And this was part of the thinking behind the war in Iraq. was the idea that this would serve as a catalyst for the democratization of the Middle East. Because everybody wants freedom. Given freedom, they'll appreciate it. And these terrorists, they're out there, yes, but they don't have broad-based appeal. That was always the assumption. That this Islamic terrorism, Islamism, appeals to a certain segment of the world, that it has nothing like the universal appeal of liberalism and capitalism. Therefore, in the long run, it's not really a contender. So we just need to put our thumb in the balance to kind of get them out of there and usher in this transformation. Now, as you know, it didn't necessarily go as well as the planners had thought. But what I want to say is that I think one of the things that comes out of this, and what the president will be facing for the next 4 years, and which should become increasingly apparent to us, is that we actually live in an immensely complex international order, and these kind of theories that people develop to guide policy might be adequate in some places and others, but if you're looking for something like a global strategic vision for transformative world leadership, right, which is what everybody wants the United States to have, I'm not sure you're going to be able to have it. I'm not sure that reality will allow you to have such a thing right now. And I think the last 4 years of the Obama presidency has partly shown that. So I wasn't timing myself, so I guess I wasn't trying for temperance. But how long have I been going? Has anybody been timing me?
I'm not timing you either, John.
I'm at the end of this.
You're at the end.
I can just keep going. No, okay, so let me just say a few things, a few general things, and then a few specific things about the president will be facing, and then I'll sit down. So as I said, we live in a messy, complicated world, but it is still the case that the U.S. is, in Madeleine Albright's phrase, the indispensable nation in certain ways. And I mean that in a kind of morally neutral way, just in the sense that there are certain things that we do for the world order that no other state can do. There is no, we might have rivals in certain areas, there is no country that right now could replace the United States, nor even are countries like China looking to displace us right now and our place in the international order. That might sound surprising to some of you, but it's true. Because the U.S., despite certain fears about decline, we are, for example, the anchor of the global economy as it currently works. Proof by the negative. When our economy went really bad, we took the rest of the world with us, right, in 2008. Okay, our bad mortgages hurt everybody else. That shows how central we are. The dollar, the yen, the Chinese yen, the euro is not going to replace the dollar anytime soon as a reserve currency. And also, our military supplies you could say, the global security for international trade. There is no other country that has so many military and naval bases flowing all around the world, protecting all the different shipping lanes that let the goods and services and the resources move around that everybody needs. And every potential rival that we have needs that global economic order that we are the linchpin of. So we are stuck with being not so much tariff, and not even really the manager, but just kind of the heavy. And we've got to maintain that. I mean, I don't mean that necessarily that we morally have to, but in the sense that most people who know what they're doing, most political leaders who know what they're doing recognize this role that the United States plays, recognizes that they can't play it, and that they actually stand to gain from the U.S. continuing to do it. And so that's why the way that China and Russia and other countries are competing with us is much more subtle, and subtle in a way that has to be dealt with a degree of prudence that forgoes any just kind of cookie-cutter application of theories about how things develop. So I don't think we are in a position at this point to provide anything like a transformative leadership that could say, get the world back on the right track or anything like that. And I would also say that to a large extent, it's really events that determine what will happen. We can't foresee the future. And so it's very hard to predict what the president will end up having to do in the next 4 years, because the international situation can change relatively quickly. If there were a second 9/11, right, we'd be facing a different kind of administration all of a sudden. So now that being said, you can say a few general things. President Obama is a second-term president. That means he doesn't have to worry about being reelected anymore. There are certain constraints then that could be lifted from his international agenda. But, and this is the thing to keep in mind, so if you might come across some arguments saying now Obama can unleash what he really wants to do. So he doesn't have to worry about being reelected anymore. Problem is, he's still concerned about the fate of the Democrats after he's not president. So oftentimes presidents are very loath to do anything that's going to really hurt their party even after they're gone. Not always. Bush supported the surge, which turned out to be a good idea. But it did hurt the Republicans in the elections at the time, right? He thought that it would work in the long run, but he got beat up over that, right? But he was willing to do it because he thought it was the right thing. That's not usually what you find, though. But so presidents are concerned about the fate of their party, and presidents are concerned about their legacy in this. So that can make them kind of selective about what more kind of principled options they pursue in the world. So even though he's not as constrained as he was before, I think it would be very hard to find him doing anything grand and new. I don't think he necessarily has those options right now. Even if both he and the European Union now hold the Nobel Peace Prize, I still don't think that they can do that. So, and of course you can put on all of this too, that you could call the Iraq syndrome, which is that I don't think there's a lot of appetite in the electorate or among a lot of the ruling class, did I say that? The elite, for any more military ventures anytime soon. And in fact, I can't remember what the latest poll is, but when polled, the majority of Americans even still oppose intervention in Syria, which is probably the situation that most urgently could be seen as calling for intervention. Even there, we don't have a stomach for it. And Libya only worked because we basically didn't do much besides provide logistical support. So you're not going to see much in the way of, I guess that what this adds up to is the fact that after all of this kind of theorizing about where the world's going and America's place in it, we kind of end up in a situation that a lot of statesmen at a lot of places and a lot of times have found themselves, which is facing a world where the future is quite uncertain, where options are actually quite constrained, where almost anything you do carries with it almost unforeseeable risks. And that's the kind of world that Obama finds himself in. And so when it comes to dealing with China, or when it comes to dealing with Russia, or when it comes to dealing with North Korea or Iran, I doubt we're going to find any kind of grand vision guiding him. I think it's going to be a kind of piecemeal negotiating each thing at a time and trying to do it with the least possible cost to America that he can find, which means that we might end up doing some stupid things. We might also end up avoiding doing some stupid things. It's very hard to predict. So that's not quite as bad as saying that we're all going to turn into atomized oblivion. The world will go on. But if you want to talk about any particular countries, we can do that during the question period. So I'll stop now.
Thank you, Dr. Burns.
My topic is the Catholic Church in the election. Before every presidential election, the American Catholic Bishops' Conference puts out a new version of a pamphlet that they call Faithful Citizenship, or Forming Consciences in the Faithful Citizenship. It's a kind of guide that they give to Catholic voters to help think properly about the election. This year they identified 6 pressing national issues, they said, fundamental problems, which they as bishops were focused on, they said, in this election year. Those problems were 1, abortion and other threats to the lives of the sick or the unwanted. 2, threats to the rights of conscience for Catholic institutions. 3, the redefinition of marriage. 4, a devastating national and global economic crisis, the consequent unemployment, poverty, and hunger. 5, the failure to fix our broken immigration system. And 6, war, terror, and violence, especially in the Holy Land. Those are the 6 that the bishops picked, and I think it's fair to say that for one reason or another, those 6 are all issues of particular interest to the Catholic Church in this country. Since Dr. Miller's already talked about our economic crisis, and Dr. Culp's already talked about the international scene, I thought I'd say something about the 4 other issues that they listed, and what this election means for each of them, and then conclude by talking a bit more generally about what the election might mean for the future of the Catholic Church in America. I'll begin with immigration. Immigration is an issue on which the Catholic bishops of this country have spoken out frequently and forcefully, for a couple reasons, which I can put briefly as the Church has special concern for immigrants, above all because they're poor, but also in this country because they're largely Catholic. The Church has repeatedly demanded that some just solution be found to the enormous problem that our country currently has, meaning that, depending on your estimate, there are somewhere between 11 million and 15 million people currently within our borders who have broken our laws to get here, but are now often here with family ties, regular jobs, children in school, and other connections to the life of our nation. What are we going to do about this problem? And do the results of this election mean that we're going to fix it anytime soon? I'm not an expert on the issue of immigration, but I'm given to understand that everyone who has thought about it and who isn't a politician, who therefore has an incentive not to see it clearly, pretty much agrees on the basic steps that have to be taken. Many politicians may see it too, but have an incentive not to say so. Constituents. The two basic steps are, one, to provide some sort of guest worker status or other form of amnesty for all or most of the illegals who are already here. We will never have the resources to deport 11 million people, even if we thought it was a good idea. There's a national security threat to have them here undocumented, and they are not going to self-deport. This is a political necessity. It has to be accepted, whatever you think of it. And it seems to me that President Obama at least has accepted it. In fact, better than Mitt Romney had. Obama has already granted such amnesty for young illegals who were brought here as little kids by their parents, which is a small step in the right direction. Obviously, secondly, and in tandem with that, we will have to spend a lot of money securing the border better. Otherwise, an amnesty program like that is a big sign saying more people come across our border and take advantage of it. This would have to be a major bipartisan piece of legislation. I actually think that this election, with a Democratic president and a divided Congress, could be what we need to make it finally happen after many years of failure, because each party is going to have to make major compromises if this will happen. Either their constituents are not going to like, and now each could go home and blame it all on the other party. Obama is also going to want something memorable as a legacy for his second term. Clinton tried the Israeli peace process. That didn't work. Bush tried Social Security. That didn't work. Maybe Obama will try immigration. I don't want to be too optimistic about this, but I do think it's possible to hope for and work on. On the three other issues that the bishops listed, the church technically doesn't have a political teaching, of course, but she does have moral teachings that are pretty closely tied to certain political stances, and those political stances took a beating at the polls on Tuesday. On marriage, we had for the first time 2 and probably 3 states waiting on a count in Washington that legalized gay marriage not just by the actions of their legislature or their state judges, but by statewide referendum of voters. There had been 32 referenda like this in the past several years, all of which had failed. Now 2 or probably 3 have succeeded. Maine, Maryland, and probably Washington have been added to Connecticut, Iowa, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, and DC as places that recognize marriage between same-sex couples. On the other hand, 30 other states now have from previous elections, have state constitutional amendments defining marriage as between one man and one woman. This is a very awkward situation for the full faith and credit clause of our Constitution, as well as for federalism, since we also have a federal law on the books called DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, that says the federal government also recognizes only heterosexual marriage. How will this get resolved? Well, as Tocqueville says, sooner or later, almost every political question in America becomes a judicial question. At least 3 federal appeals courts have already ruled in the past 2 years that discriminating between heterosexual and homosexual couples with regard to marriage is unconstitutional. Those cases will go to the Supreme Court sometime in the next few years, most likely. When they do, they will now face a funny situation. The executive branch of government, the Justice Department, is refusing to defend the law DOMA in court because the president himself believes it's unconstitutional. Checks and balances at work. Certainly there will be some lawyers from somewhere who will step forward to defend the law, but those lawyers will be in the uncomfortable and rather weak position of defending a U.S. law that the U.S. itself is unwilling to defend. I believe, and this I'm really trespassing on Dr. Upham's territory here, I believe, and I hope he'll correct me, that the current Supreme Court would uphold DOMA 5-4. 2 of those 5, however, are 76 years old and may well have to retire in the next 4 years, depending on their health, in which case Obama would certainly replace them as justices who would strike down not only DOMA, but the laws of all 30 states that have currently banned gay marriage. On abortion, something similar is true. We currently have 4 Supreme Court justices who probably favor overturning Roe versus Wade, although 2 of them haven't spoken publicly about it. 1 swing vote, Kennedy, who's in favor of Roe versus Wade, but allows for at least some restrictions on abortion, and 4 who, again, although we don't know for sure, would probably strike down any restrictions on abortion whatsoever. Am I within bounds here? Those numbers certainly are not going to shift in any pro-life direction in the second Obama term, and again, depending on the health of Justices Scalia and Kennedy, they could go in quite the opposite direction. And of course, through the so-called HHS mandate attached to Obamacare, all employers, including the University of Dallas, and all Catholic schools and hospitals will now are now on track to be forced within a year to pay for health coverage for their employees that includes not only contraception and sterilization, but also so-called Plan B, emergency contraception, the morning after pill, which the church considers an abortifacient. Which brings me to the last of those 4 issues the bishops listed, the rights of conscience for Catholic employers. Catholic bishops have been quite vocal this past year in making the argument that this HHS mandate is an unacceptable assault on religious liberty, using more forceful language than I believe American bishops have used about any other live political issue in quite a long time. I have one of these quotes here, which I'll skip for now in the interest of time. I can read it later if you want, but I will say every American bishop agreed unanimously to a statement several months ago that called the HHS mandate unjust and illegal. Those are strong words. So it's been pretty clear for almost a year that the Obama administration had entered into the biggest and most public fight with the U.S. Catholic bishops that any president has entered into in at least 29 years and probably much longer. It now looks like the president has won that fight, the qualification I'll give in a second. Now that he's been reelected, he has possible exception for what Dr. Culp was talking about concerning for his party, but I suspect, I would say, he has virtually no incentive to take the bishops seriously on this anymore, if he was inclined to in the first place. More on that in a second, but I'll just admit there's one other issue I didn't fit in, which is that the Catholic bishops of Massachusetts organized a campaign against a referendum that we had in Massachusetts referendum on physician-assisted suicide. This was, every Catholic church had to have this homily against it broadcast in our diocese of Boston. It was almost as strong terms as the campaign against the HHS mandate. This was successful. The bill to pass assisted suicide failed in Massachusetts, and that was one success for the Catholic bishops in that state. That's all that's happened. What does it mean then for the future of the Catholic Church? A couple things I'd say. First of all, in Maryland, Maine, Washington, and possibly sometime in the next few years, the whole country, you're likely to see what my former home state of Massachusetts has already seen, namely new public school textbooks to reflect the new marriage laws. Children from kindergarten on will now be taught that a family can have a mom and a dad, 2 moms or 2 dads. Makes sense. That's what the law says. This means that even more conservative Christians, more conservative Catholics and other conservative Christians will be likely to pull their kids out of public schools and into private schools, if they happen to live near private schools they can afford, or to start homeschooling. While the great majority of Catholics will not do that. Their kids, the kids of the great majority, will be shaped by what they hear in school, of course, besides the thousand other barely noticeable ways that a law of such importance shapes the culture. So we will continue to see an ever-widening cultural divide between mainstream Catholics on the one hand, whose moral beliefs will continue to track, as they already largely do, the moral beliefs of mainstream Americans, and the small number of committed religious conservatives, on the other hand, who will feel increasingly disconnected from their country, and the bishops trying somehow to hold all those people together. Not a great situation for the church from either or almost any point of view. Second prediction, in the next year, Catholics will experience the humiliation of having to watch their bishops beg the administration to be left alone and get denied, unless the president decides to be gratuitously generous to them in a way that I think he has very little incentive to be. The bishops may sue. This is the exception that I mentioned. At least one Catholic small businessman just did a few weeks ago. I got this, and Dave Upham reminded me that there are 2 other lawsuits that I missed because I was writing my dissertation this July. Lived under a rock. If they sue, and this is what David was just correcting me on before, there's at least a good chance that the bishops would lose if they sued over this. The situation for them is better than I realized. Dr. Upham reminded me of a statute that I didn't know about. It's not clear how this would be resolved, but it's at least up in the air. If it went to the Supreme Court, there's at least a significant possibility that there would be an even more uncomfortable spectacle for Catholics of 6 Catholic laymen on the court telling their bishops to back off. The case on the grounds of the federal law and the Constitution is not entirely clear, but there's a lot of it's pretty open to interpretation in either direction, it seems. Besides suing in court, it's possible that some bishops could threaten to close down Catholic schools or Catholic hospitals rather than pay for contraception coverage for their employees. That's a threat that I think the president would take seriously if it were a serious threat. American healthcare certainly cannot run without the Catholic hospital system, but it would not be a serious threat. For that reason, I suspect the bishops won't even bother to make it. The lay people who run hospitals and schools would never stand for their being shut down over this issue. If the bishops were to lose in court, then the church, it seems to me, and in particular her bishops, are going to lose some credibility. Politicians especially, and perhaps with some of the faithful, because they've picked a losing battle. And if they lose it, they're going to lose it not by dying as martyrs, everybody respects a martyr, but by just caving in. Within a year or two, barring some sort of victory in the courts, every Catholic school and hospital in the country will have done the thing that the bishops have been saying we would be unacceptably violating our consciences if we ever did. I don't know exactly how they'll explain it. I'm not a theologian. I'm not even saying whether it's a good or a bad thing, but if the bishops is in court, it will happen, it seems to me. And that will make it harder for some people to believe the bishops next time they claim that a given moral issue is an absolutely non-negotiable part of Catholic faith. So regardless of your stance on the HHS mandate, or for that matter on gay marriage and contraception, it seems to me fair to say that this election has hurt the Catholic Church in at least some important ways. I therefore conclude with one small note of optimism, along with a shameless plug. One thing this election may do is help at least a few young Catholics notice how much harm it has done to the intellectual life of the American church, that for a couple hundred years that church has almost completely neglected the study of political philosophy. And we saw this with unusual clarity, I think, in the great crudity of the arguments about conscience and religious liberty that have been adopted and thrown around by nearly all parties in the HHS debate. If you want to know what those terms actually mean, there are books you have to study. And if you happen to be at the University of Dallas, there are some excellent courses where you can study them. Dr. Dougherty is teaching Catholic political thought next semester. I'm teaching Enlightenment political thought. Dr. Culp is teaching contemporary political thought. David Upham is teaching civil rights, to name only the four most obviously relevant to church-state issues. Catholics, or any students interested in understanding better the proper relationship between church and state, between church and politics, might find in the results of this election a good motivation to better their understanding of issues that today, as it seems to me, the American church as a whole understands all too poorly.
Thanks. I want to say something about the Obama administration for the last 4 years, and only something, maybe one sentence about what we might expect for the next 4 years. President Obama entered office in January of 2009 amidst much hope that he would usher in a new age of post-partisanship, a post-racial and post-ethnic America that many people seem to want, or at least say that they want. Aided along by ideological bedfellows and by friendly independents and Republicans, including those impressed by the crease in his pant legs, David Brooks. There was much anticipation about how Washington and America as a whole would be transformed. And while one would have to say that his first term produced some significant successes for him, most notably the 2009 stimulus package and the 2010 Affordable Care Act, it is otherwise difficult, I think, to judge his success as an executive. Like his Democratic predecessor, Bill Clinton, President Obama, I think, does have a large vision for the country. Unlike Bill Clinton, the president, though, has shown few signs of being willing to tack to the center when he sees potential for political success there. This may be accounted for, in part, of course, by the fact that they are simply different personalities. But it's also the case that President Clinton had experienced political defeat early in his career, and that experience seemed to have led him to be willing to engage others in conversation and negotiation. He was chastened, of course, as president with the arrival of a Republican Congress following the 1994 election, but one has to note that he was willing to work with them. And importantly, his most important piece of legislation in his first term, arguably, the North American Free Trade Agreement, he pushed through only because he had substantial Republican support. President Obama's youth and relative political inexperience, I would suggest, did not help him in his first term, and indeed set a dangerous precedent for future American presidential aspirants. Please wait till you're older. Neither did his exalted view of himself help him. Seen in his view, stated as his own stated view, that he was a better speechwriter and a better political strategist than his top advisors. That could not have made them feel good. And that he considers his presidency, he stated this year, as running on a par superior to all other presidencies, with the possible exception of Lincoln, FDR, and LBJ. One might also point to his Nobel Prize, mentioned earlier, granted apparently because he was not George Bush. Now, winning that, of course, was not his fault. But imagine the impact had he declined it. He didn't decline it. President Obama places a great deal of emphasis on his capacity for speaking. And though many consider him a great orator, there is, I think, almost nothing memorable about what he has said. That is a single line that he has said in any one of his speeches. When asked this spring or summer what, if anything, he had failed at in his first administration, he noted he could only think of one thing, and that is that he had failed to provide a narrative for the American people, or a story of the success of his administration. The president has shown little interest, I think, in the tasks that make one a strong executive within our political system. Part of the reason for that is, I think, that he seems to have no interest in or talent for persuading those who do not agree with him. He seems not adept at listening, a point made routinely by members of Congress of his own party and by staff alike. Some of you perhaps saw a new book out recently by one of his former staffers that said, well, he just doesn't like people. She retracted that later on, so I didn't really mean that. Perhaps the best example of this came early on in his presidency, indeed 3 days after he was inaugurated, when he met with members of Congress to discuss possibilities for dealing with the economic crisis we faced. After telling the assembled members what he thought about things, he entertained their comments, only to finally, in frustration, cut off House Republican Whip Eric Cantor with the words, "Elections have consequences, and Eric, I won." In other words, here, just 3 days into his administration, the president was making it clear that there would be no negotiation, no compromise, no reaching across the aisles. We might say there would be no post-partisanship presidency. President Obama is not a bridge builder. And indeed, he got no Republican members, House members, to vote for the stimulus package, and only 3 Republican senators to support it. Arlen Specter, who then became a Democrat, and 2 senators from Maine. Perhaps more importantly, on the sign of his relative lack of interest, I think, is that the signature piece of legislation from his first term, what he has himself embraced as Obamacare, was created with, in fact, little input, at least publicly, from the president himself. Keeping his distance from the details of the negotiations that is in the structure of the bill, presumably to provide plausible deniability from taking responsibility for the legislation not to pass, the president only came to embrace the legislation when in fact it looked like it might pass. And in light of its relative unpopularity, I think certain parts of it are certainly popular, but in light of its relative unpopularity, he refrained from employing the term Obamacare until lately, when he has now in fact publicly embraced it. But there are also certain areas where the president has aggressively used the power of the executive office, often employing the same tactics used by his predecessor, George Bush, but without suffering the political repercussions that Bush endured. And I'll just list some of them. For example, President Obama has used the same kind of signing statements that President Bush used to exert independent authority, the independent authority of the executive, especially to control the bureaucracy. The bombing of Libya, which I think was a clear violation of the War Powers Resolution. His use of drone attacks. His dismissal of officials who undermine his political allies. He makes recess appointments when Congress technically was in session and not in recess. He's instructed Homeland Security to not prosecute cases against illegal immigrants. During the campaign, he used the power of the IRS and other agencies to investigate donors to Romney's election bid. This is part of the much vaunted Chicago way. He's refused to, as was mentioned, he's refused to defend the defense of marriage. What's important is none of these actions required working with his opponents. Right? These are things which the executive simply has done on his own, even without having to work with his own party in Congress. In addition to making use of that authority, he has also seized the opportunity. By the way, that's not a partisan point. All presidents have done that, right? So it's a question of where you're going to use that kind of power, on what issues you're going to use it. I think he's used it on bigger issues and especially more important social issues, but it's not as if no presidents have used those powers before. In addition, though, to making use of such authority, he's also seized the opportunity to deploy grants of power from Congress to the president as a way of aggrandizing his authority. One could think, for example, of the aforementioned HHS mandate and the contraceptive coverage that was simply done because Congress gave the Secretary the power to do that. The Keystone Pipeline, which the President prevented from being built, even though he really has no authority to do that. This was a power, the kind of power that he exercised here was first employed by a president in the 1960s. But there really was no justification for it. But Congress has gone along with it, so they've never stopped him from doing this. He's removed the work requirements for welfare recipients, essentially gutting the 1996 welfare reform. He's refused to endorse the nation's drug laws when the administration has not been successful at getting Congress to change them. Complicated, of course, because we had a few more states legalize marijuana. Well, how can you legalize it when it's illegal, right, at the national level? Well, because we don't prosecute it at the national level. So the president, so again, here, these are all examples where Congress has created an avenue for the president to exercise power, and he has seized it. The president pointedly noted last year that, quote, the idea of doing things on my own is very tempting. He was talking about immigration reform, but then he said, but that's not how our system works. Yes, it is how our system works. The system routinely provides enormous discretion to the president or to administrative agencies, who then turn around and implement that authority as they see fit. Congress will exercise its oversight on such matters only when it desires to do so, and there is often little incentive to do that. In other words, Congress has systematically ceded policy-making authority to the so-called bureaucracy. Okay, well, what does the future hold for the second Obama term? Well, with a divided Congress, I think we can expect little by way of significant legislation. Dan Burns mentioned immigration reform. That is one possible place where there might be agreement between Democrats and Republicans. But we certainly, I would suggest, can expect the administration to make use of every one of its tools to promote its political agenda. In the end, I think that President Obama is a moralist. When driven by what he takes to be injustices in society, in the workplace, in the world, he is capable of decisive action, but never quick action. He does almost nothing quickly, including playing golf. But in the absence of an animating moral principle, he is largely, I think, a ditheroo. And when he does act, he does it without being fully committed to it. In the Afghan surge, for example, he waited months beyond the timeline for the requested additional troops. And when he did decide to send them, he sent 10,000 fewer than were requested, and then he set a deadline for withdrawing them. Based on what we know from what happened in Benghazi on September 11th of this year, I think the same can be said for that. Right? Many have asked, why would he hesitate to send troops in to help out our citizens who are under fire? Well, I think that when you are hesitant about whether you're right, about whether we should be there, about whether we deserve the punishment we are receiving, it's difficult to act convincingly and authoritatively. So in the end, again, I would suggest President Obama actually seems to have little interest in government. He does love to campaign, though. And that, I think, was apparently enough to spur him on to pursue a second term. And Bill Clinton, like I think we can certainly expect to see him routinely on the campaign trail for others for decades to come, once he has left office in 2017. I want to conclude with this comment about opponents, the attempt to understand President Obama. I think it behooves his opponents to try to understand his nature, his character, and to recognize where and why he does seem to reach, to touch the needs and the desires of the American people. And here, let me cite a brief passage from Tocqueville, in which Tocqueville talks about the kinds of things that in a democracy one needs to be aware of. And he says this about potential leaders in democracy. He says, what one must fear is not so much the sight of the immorality of the great, as that of immorality leading to greatness. In democracy, plain citizens see a man who issues from their ranks and who in a few years achieves wealth and power. The spectacle excites their surprise and their envy. They inquire how he who was their equal yesterday is vested today with the right to direct them. To attribute his elevation to his talents or his virtues is inconvenient, for it is to avow they are less virtuous and less skillful than he, which of course is something we could never admit. They therefore place the principal cause of it, that is in his success, in some of his vices, and often they are right in doing so. Thus there is at work some sort of odious mixing of ideas of baseness and power, of unworthiness and success, of utility and dishonor. This, I think, it goes somewhat to explaining the reaction that many people have to President Obama. It's important, though, I think, to distinguish Obama the man and Obama the candidate from Obama the politician. He appears, I think, almost universally as a likable individual. One cannot understand him, I think, by simply being envious of him. It is important to acknowledge his strengths, including his strengths of character. He has a fine singing voice, for example, and he has an attractive family. This, I think, is absolutely remarkable, given his own background. I think this is something that the people simply have to acknowledge. And he does look crisp in a suit. So you have to recognize these things, these characteristics, I think, of Barack Obama before you can understand the appeal of President Obama. Thank you.